I never thought anyone would see me here. West Germany, late summer 1945. Elisabeth Kraus crouched among the remnants of what had once been a lively marketplace, the scent of wet cobblestone and crushed leaves hanging in the air, a thin haze rising from distant chimneys. Her hands, pale and calloused from weeks of scavenging, trembled as she sifted through the scattered grain on the ground. She weighed each kernel carefully, as if measuring hope itself. Sunlight pierced through the gaps between crumbling buildings, dust motes floating like tiny sparks in the golden beams. In the distance, a jeep rumbled down the uneven street, raising a swirl of red-brown dust that hung suspended, blurring the edges of the town. From the driver's seat, James Carter, a U.S. Navy sailor, stepped out with measured steps, his polished boots thudding against the packed earth. His gaze swept the deserted square, lingering on the slight figure huddled behind a toppled cart. Elisabeth's eyes, pale blue and wary, darted to him, then away, following a memory of strict orders and whispered warnings that Americans were merciless. He paused, hands resting lightly on his belt, not advancing too quickly, giving space, letting the sun cast his shadow long and soft across the debris. He unfastened his rucksack and pulled out a small canteen and a wrapped ration, setting it down a few feet from where she crouched. Elisabeth's breath caught, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features as she studied the motion, trying to decipher intention from action. James spoke, slow and deliberate. "You must be hungry," his accent sharp but kind, though she could not understand the words fully. She tilted her head, silent, scanning his face for threats. No harsh lines, no anger, only the measured calm of someone used to assessing situations. He unwrapped the ration, breaking off a piece and lifting it to his own mouth, nodding once, as if to say, "See, it's safe." The movement, simple and unspoken, bridged a chasm of fear. Elisabeth's hands hovered over the food, her fingers trembling, the taste of desperation mixing with caution. Dust clung to her hair, and the sweat on her brow glistened in the sunlight, catching a fleeting gold glow. Around them, the quiet of the square pressed in. A crow cawed from a distant rooftop, a loose shutter creaked in the breeze. Time seemed to stretch, measured in heartbeats. In shallow breaths, Elisabeth finally leaned forward, eyes flicking to his as she allowed her hands to touch the ration. Her lips met the food, hesitant at first, savoring the solid reality of nourishment. James watched silently, a gentle presence, giving her control, letting her take the first step toward trust. The breeze lifted a loose scarf around her shoulders, brushing against his forearm, and though neither spoke, a small acknowledgement passed between them. The afternoon sun warmed the broken stones, yet the air held the tension of recent conflict and unspoken understanding. Dusty footprints traced paths through the square as they moved, each step deliberate, careful. Elisabeth lifted her gaze to him fully, noticing the quiet steadiness in his posture, the calm in his eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that felt like safety. He crouched slightly to her level, offering a small smile that did not demand reciprocity, only understanding. Around them, the remnants of the marketplace seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if waiting for a moment of decision, and in that pause, the weight of weeks, the hunger, the uncertainty, and the faintest glimmer of hope converged, setting the stage for a bond that neither had anticipated, a delicate, unspoken promise that life, even in ruins, could harbor a measure of kindness. The jeep rattled along the uneven cobblestone street, the tires raising small puffs of dust that settled slowly in the golden afternoon light. Elisabeth Kraus followed cautiously behind, her footsteps tentative on the uneven stones, every movement measured, as if the ground itself might betray her. She carried the empty canteen in her hands, now lighter, but still a reminder of the hunger that had shadowed her for days. James Carter walked beside her, hands relaxed at his sides, his uniform pressed, yet showing traces of the journey, the sunlight catching the polished brass buttons and reflecting a warmth that seemed incongruous against the ruined town. The silence between them was neither awkward nor tense, but filled with the weight of unspoken understanding, a bridge forming over the gap that words had not yet crossed. He pointed out a collection of scattered crates along the alley, suggesting they might find some small stores of grain or preserved food, his gestures slow, deliberate, never imposing, allowing Elisabeth to lead the way. She glanced at him, pale eyes flickering, with the faintest hint of gratitude, and nodded slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line as she moved forward. Every step she took seemed heavier than the last, yet steadier, as if the mere presence of another human, careful and attentive, was slowly restoring a sense of balance. The afternoon sun warmed the broken rooftops, throwing long shadows that stretched across the street like silent witnesses to their progress. The distant sound of a church bell tolled somewhere beyond the ruins, marking an hour that neither of them tracked, yet anchoring the moment in a shared temporal space. Elisabeth reached a half-collapsed crate and knelt, sifting through its contents with precise fingers, finding a small bag of dried beans. She held it up for James to see, and he gave a brief nod of approval, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly, a subtle cue that she had done well. He crouched to her level, offering a reassuring glance, not speaking but conveying an understanding that transcended language. She allowed herself a small exhale, a release of tension she had carried for weeks, her shoulders loosening ever so slightly as she counted the beans into a makeshift pouch. The air carried the scent of dust and baked earth, mingling with the faint aroma of distant smoke, and Elisabeth breathed deeply, noticing for the first time a clarity in the atmosphere that felt almost like freedom. James rose slowly, extending a hand, and she hesitated only a moment before taking it, allowing him to help her to her feet, the motion simple yet imbued with a quiet dignity that reinforced the fragile trust forming between them. As they moved down the street together, Elisabeth glanced at the sky, a pale blue interrupted by wisps of cloud, and realized how long it had been since she had noticed color, light, or anything beyond immediate survival. James adjusted the strap of his bag, casting a glance over his shoulder to ensure she was keeping pace, his presence steady and unhurried, a grounding force amidst the ruins. They came upon a narrow alleyway where the remnants of market stalls had collapsed into the street, offering a tangle of wood and canvas that could conceal both danger and opportunity. Elisabeth's fingers brushed the edges of broken crates as she stepped carefully, and James mirrored her movements, patient and precise, guiding her without taking over, his eyes alert yet calm. She paused at a corner, peering around it before continuing, and he stayed just behind, giving her space yet ready to respond if needed. A small breeze stirred loose papers and leaves along the path, carrying with it the scent of distant fields and the faint hum of life beyond the town's borders. Elisabeth inhaled, tasting the possibility of normalcy, and felt a warmth bloom within her chest, a tentative spark of hope that she had not allowed herself to recognize. James slowed his pace, allowing her to catch up fully, and in that small gesture of patience, Elisabeth felt a subtle reassurance that she was not being rushed, not being judged, only observed with a care that had been absent from her world for far too long. The afternoon light began to lengthen, shadows stretching further across the cobblestones, and they moved in tandem, a rhythm forming between them, a shared pattern of steps and glances that hinted at trust and understanding. Elisabeth's hands, now steadier, brushed against the rough wood of a fallen shutter, and she looked to James, who offered a faint smile, a quiet acknowledgement of progress. They reached a small square, partially cleared of debris, where sunlight poured onto the stones, warming them and casting the ruined buildings into relief. She knelt again, examining a pile of scattered corn kernels, and he crouched beside her, offering a careful observation, his voice low and deliberate, guiding without commanding. Elisabeth looked at him fully for the first time, her eyes meeting his, and in that gaze was a silent communication, a recognition of shared humanity amidst the desolation. The church bell tolled again, marking the passing of time, yet their focus remained inward, on the immediate, on the small victories of survival and the quiet building of trust. Each movement, each gesture, each careful step contributed to a fragile bond, unspoken yet potent, forming the foundation for the connection that would continue to grow, slowly and deliberately, as they navigated the remnants of the town together. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm amber glow across the fractured rooftops and dusty streets. Deliberate, the rubble crunching softly underfoot. The town stretched ahead, silent but for the occasional distant bird call and the faint whisper of wine through the broken shutters. James paused at a bend in the street, surveying the path forward. He pointed to a narrow lane where a few intact crates leaned against the wall of a partially standing building. Elisabeth approached first, crouching to inspect the contents, and James watched closely, his expression calm, patient, and reassuring. She lifted a small tin of preserved fruit, brushing off a layer of dust and examining it carefully before turning to him. He nodded, a quiet affirmation that it was suitable, and she allowed herself a faint smile, a small acknowledgement of shared understanding. The light had softened now, shifting from gold to the muted hues of late afternoon, shadows stretching long across the cobblestones, folding the street in patterns that seemed to mirror the cautious rhythm between them. Elisabeth adjusted her scarf, the fabric catching a stray sunbeam, and felt the faint warmth on her shoulders, a gentle reminder that comfort could exist even amidst desolation. They continued down the lane, stepping over small piles of debris, Elisabeth moving with careful precision, James mirroring her pace, neither speaking, yet their movements in harmony, an unspoken choreography of trust. Around them, the buildings leaned and sagged with age, some partially collapsed, others still standing like silent sentinels witnessing the slow reclamation of life. The scent of earth and distant smoke mingled in the air, carrying memories of times before destruction, before scarcity, before fear. Elisabeth paused to examine a small patch of green sprouting between cracks in the pavement, her fingers brushing the leaves lightly, marveling at the persistence of life. James crouched beside her, pointing to a cluster of similar growths further along the lane, a gentle gesture of connection, an invitation to notice resilience in the smallest of things. She glanced at him, eyes meeting his, and for the first time allowed a flicker of trust to pass between them, a subtle acknowledgement that not all humans were defined by the chaos of war. A soft breeze lifted, stirring loose papers and fragments of fabric, carrying them across the street in lazy spirals. Elisabeth inhaled, drawing the scent of dry earth, a faint sweetness from the preserved fruit, and a trace of distant smoke. Each inhalation seemed to settle her thoughts, grounding her in the present moment, in the simple reality of walking alongside another person who cared, silently, attentively. They reached a small open courtyard where sunlight spilled freely, illuminating broken benches and the remnants of a once busy marketplace. Elisabeth knelt briefly, examining scattered corn kernels, counting them with precision, and James crouched beside her, observing with quiet interest, offering occasional guidance through gestures and soft, deliberate expressions. She looked to him fully, pale eyes searching, and found only steady attention and unspoken reassurance. In that gaze was a fragile connection, an understanding that both relied on one another, not out of necessity alone, but because the presence of another human could transform the weight of solitude into a tentative partnership. As the sun dipped lower, the street seemed to lengthen and shift, shadows stretching further across the stones, and the town, in all its fractured stillness, held a moment of calm. Elisabeth felt a faint surge of hope, subtle yet persistent, the sense that amidst the ruins and uncertainty, small acts of patience, observation, and care could forge bonds stronger than fear. James remained beside her, walking slowly, offering quiet presence, a steadying rhythm against the fragility of the afternoon. Each step, each glance, each measured movement reinforced the trust building between them, a careful foundation upon which understanding, and perhaps something more enduring, could grow. The light faded gradually, brushing the remaining walls with hues of amber and rose, and Elisabeth breathed deeply, the rhythm of her steps aligning with James's, a silent agreement that the day, though long and uncertain, had yielded something remarkable in its quiet, shared journey through the remnants of a world slowly reclaiming life. The sky had shifted to a deep, soft blue, streaked with the lingering gold of the setting sun, and the ruins of the town seemed to glow in a delicate, almost reverent light. Elisabeth Kraus walked beside James Carter, her steps growing steadier, each movement less hesitant than before. The beans and dried fruit she had gathered were now tucked securely into her small pouch, the weight a comforting presence rather than a reminder of scarcity. James moved with a quiet attentiveness, his eyes sweeping the street ahead, noting uneven stones and loose debris, always mindful of her pace. A gentle wind stirred the dust, and the faint aroma of distant flowers carried on it, a whisper of life. Returning to the world, Elisabeth paused at a corner where a narrow alley opened into a larger square, the remnants of a fountain half buried under rubble. She crouched, fingers brushing the stones as she examined a patch of moss thriving in the cracks, a testament to persistence and quiet strength. James crouched beside her, his gaze following hers, and without a word, offered her a hand to steady her as she rose, a simple gesture that spoke volumes in the language of trust. The courtyard stretched before them, bathed in the warm light, shadows elongating across the cobblestones like slow-moving sentinels. Elisabeth allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply, inhaling the mixture of earth, dust, and faint floral hints, feeling for the first time a sense of presence that was not consumed by fear. James adjusted the strap of his bag, nodding toward a cluster of wooden crates that appeared intact, suggesting they might contain supplies or small comforts from before the destruction. Elisabeth approached cautiously, examining the contents with meticulous care, while James remained nearby, giving her space while ready to respond, his posture calm and deliberate. The light played across the edges of broken windows and shuttered doors, highlighting textures and details that had long been ignored in her life, consumed by survival. She discovered a tin of dried fruit, brushing it off and turning it over in her hands, weighing its value, and James nodded once, a quiet affirmation that she had chosen wisely. A soft breeze lifted her hair across her face, and she blinked, letting a small smile break through the tension that had long been her companion. They continued through the square, moving with careful rhythm, Elisabeth occasionally glancing at James, noticing the subtle steadiness of his movements, the patience that allowed her to lead at her own pace. Around them, the town seemed to settle into a stillness, each broken wall and leaning beam absorbing the soft light, the atmosphere charged with quiet potential, the sense that life might gradually return to spaces long abandoned. Elisabeth spotted a cluster of small, sprouting plants along the edge of the square, tiny green shoots pushing through stone and dust, and James pointed to them, a gentle nod encouraging observation, a silent acknowledgement that resilience was everywhere if one took the time to notice. She bent to examine the shoots, her fingers brushing the fragile leaves, feeling a connection to something persistent, enduring, and quietly hopeful. James stayed beside her, watching with careful attentiveness, his presence a stabilizing force, a quiet assurance that she was not alone. The sunlight shifted further, bathing the courtyard in warm hues of amber and rose, elongating shadows across the cobblestones, and Elisabeth felt a subtle easing within herself, a tentative trust that had begun to take root. Each movement, each shared glance, each deliberate step reinforced a bond that had formed in the quiet spaces between words and actions, a connection built on patience, care, and mutual respect. As they moved toward the far end of the square, Elisabeth lifted her gaze fully to James, and in that moment, the ruins around them seemed to fade slightly, replaced by the recognition of shared human presence, the quiet promise of guidance, companionship, and the possibility of hope that stretched beyond the boundaries of the town. The shadows had deepened as the late afternoon sun dipped further, washing the broken town in muted shades of amber and rose, and Elisabeth Kraus and James Carter moved carefully through the narrow lanes, their steps falling in a measured rhythm that spoke of growing understanding and silent companionship. Elisabeth adjusted the pouch at her side, the collected beans and dried fruit a small comfort and a sign of persistence, each kernel representing a minor triumph over scarcity and uncertainty. James kept a watchful eye ahead and around, his posture calm, his movements deliberate, never rushing her, giving her the space to navigate the uneven stones and scattered debris while remaining close enough to offer steady support. The soft rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze carried faint sense of damp earth and distant greenery, a reminder that life continued in quiet, subtle ways even amidst the ruins. They arrived at a small courtyard where the remnants of a fountain formed a shallow, dry basin, scattered with stones and patches of resilient moss. Elisabeth crouched, her hands brushing the moss and small shoots of grass that had begun to reclaim the neglected stone, tracing delicate lines across the surface as if mapping the fragile signs of renewal. James knelt beside her, observing her attentively, his presence steady, a quiet reassurance that she was not alone in this tentative exploration of life amid desolation. She glanced at him, and in his attentive gaze, found an unspoken understanding, a sense that patience and observation were acts of care as meaningful as any words. The golden light caught the edges of her hair, casting soft highlights that seemed almost luminous against the muted tones of the courtyard, and she allowed herself a small exhale, a fleeting acknowledgement of comfort that she had not permitted herself in weeks. They moved forward together, Elisabeth leading cautiously through the rubble, her eyes scanning for small resources or signs of stability, James following with gentle attention, guiding subtly with gestures, his presence a steady anchor in the shifting environment. A pile of broken crates caught her attention, and she carefully examined the contents, uncovering a tin of preserved fruit and a small bag of grains, brushing away dust and debris, measuring each piece with care. James nodded, silent approval passing between them, and Elisabeth felt a quiet confidence in her choices, a subtle shift from mere survival to mindful engagement with the world around her. The sunlight softened further, shadows lengthening across the cobblestones and walls, lending a calm weight to the air, and Elisabeth allowed herself a fleeting glance toward James, noting the calm steadiness in his posture, the unhurried movements, and the patience that had become a subtle, reassuring rhythm in their shared passage. They continued through the open courtyard, careful steps echoing softly against the stones, each movement deliberate and synchronized, a silent dialogue of trust and attention. The distant hum of wind through broken shutters mingled with the faint rustle of leaves and scattered papers, filling the space with a sense of gentle life returning to the town. Elisabeth noticed small clusters of plants pushing through cracks and around the edges of broken stone, and James nodded toward them, encouraging observation, a quiet gesture emphasizing resilience and hope. She bent to examine them more closely, her fingers brushing the tender leaves, sensing in these small signs of life a reflection of the tentative trust forming between them. James remained close, his eyes attentive yet unobtrusive, offering a presence that allowed her to move confidently and carefully, reinforcing the quiet bond that had grown from patience, care, and shared attention to the world around them. The late light bathed the courtyard in hues of soft amber and rose, shadows stretching further across the cobblestones and broken stone, and Elisabeth felt a subtle easing of tension within herself, a delicate trust that had begun to take root in the presence of steady guidance. Each measured step, each exchanged glance, each quiet movement contributed to the formation of a fragile yet meaningful connection, a foundation for understanding and companionship built on shared patience, observation, and attentiveness. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting a warm, lingering glow across the town, and Elisabeth breathed deeply, allowing herself to take in the rhythm of steps, the gentle presence of another human nearby, and the quiet assurance that amidst the ruins, small acts of care and attention could create moments of stability, trust, and the beginnings of hope. The horizon softened into shades of lavender and gold as the sun began to dip behind the distant hills, casting long, delicate shadows across the broken streets of the town. Elisabeth Kraus adjusted the strap of her small pouch, feeling the reassuring weight of the food she had gathered, and took a measured step forward, her eyes scanning the uneven cobblestones and scattered remnants of what had once been a lively marketplace. James Carter walked beside her, his presence steady and unobtrusive, offering a silent support that allowed her to navigate the ruins with growing confidence. The air carried a faint scent of earth and distant greenery, mingling with the warmth of the late afternoon sun, and Elisabeth inhaled deeply, savoring the simple, grounding reality of breath, movement, and presence. They turned a corner, entering a wider square where sunlight poured across the ground, illuminating the textures of broken stone, leaning walls, and sprouting moss. Elisabeth knelt briefly, examining a small patch of sprouting plants, her fingers brushing the tender green shoots, a small smile forming on her lips at the quiet persistence of life. James crouched beside her, observing, his expression calm and attentive, offering an unspoken acknowledgement of her careful attention to detail and the subtle beauty of resilience. She straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt, and allowed herself a moment to glance at him fully, noticing the quiet steadiness in his posture, the soft attentiveness in his gaze, and the deliberate patience that seemed to shape every movement he made. They moved slowly through the square together, each step a measured rhythm, Elisabeth leading with cautious confidence, James following with a presence that was protective yet never imposing. The town around them remained silent but alive in subtle ways, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, the faint chirping of birds returning to the area, and the distant tolling of a bell from a half-standing church lent a sense of continuity to the moment. Elisabeth discovered a small pile of intact crates near the edge of the square and carefully sifted through the contents, uncovering a tin of dried fruit and a small bag of grains, brushing off dust with careful fingers. James nodded quietly, offering a subtle affirmation that reassured her choices without words, and she allowed herself a deep exhale, feeling a fragile but growing confidence in her ability to engage with the world around her. The light shifted as the sun continued its descent, warm amber giving way to softer rose tones, shadows lengthening across the stones and broken structures, and Elisabeth felt the steady rhythm of her steps align with James's, a silent dialogue of trust, attention, and shared presence. They paused for a moment in the square, taking in the quiet beauty of the scene, the lingering warmth of sunlight on the stones, and the delicate green of resilient plants pushing through cracks, and Elisabeth felt a faint yet persistent sense of hope blooming within her chest, a recognition that care, patience, and quiet guidance could foster a sense of safety and understanding even amidst desolation. James offered a small gesture, pointing toward a partially intact building where sunlight streamed through an open doorway, suggesting shelter and a moment of respite. Elisabeth nodded, following his lead, her movements deliberate and steady, and together they entered the building, the light catching the textures of peeling paint and broken beams, illuminating the interior with a gentle, forgiving glow. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of earth and old wood, and Elisabeth paused to take it in, the sense of enclosed space offering a temporary sanctuary. James remained nearby, his eyes scanning the interior, posture calm and assured, providing a quiet sense of security. They moved slowly through the space, Elisabeth noting small details, a fallen shutter, a sprig of green emerging through a crack, the pattern of sunlight across the floor. James followed with measured steps, observing with quiet attentiveness, ensuring her comfort without intruding. The warm glow of the descending sun filtered through broken windows, illuminating both of them in a shared light, a subtle bond forming in the silence of observation, careful movement, and mutual attention. Elisabeth felt a gentle easing of the tension that had gripped her, a quiet trust taking root, and the rhythm of their movement became a shared cadence, a delicate but meaningful partnership in navigating the stillness and subtle life of the town. Each step, glance, and gesture contributed to the growing connection, a foundation of trust and understanding that allowed Elisabeth to engage with her surroundings more fully, and to sense the quiet presence of James as a stabilizing, reassuring force. As the sun sank lower, casting the town in soft shades of evening, Elisabeth breathed deeply, acknowledging the moment of calm, the subtle hope that had begun to blossom, and the quiet assurance that patience, care, and presence could cultivate a fragile but enduring sense of trust and human connection even in the midst of uncertainty. The evening light deepened into a soft, dusky orange as Elisabeth Kraus and James Carter made their careful way through the wider streets, the air carrying a gentle warmth that belied the ruins around them. Dust rose in small, lazy swirls with each step, catching the last rays of sunlight and shimmering like tiny sparks across the uneven cobblestones. Elisabeth's hands rested lightly on her pouch, the contents inside shifting slightly with her movements, a tangible reassurance of both survival and the careful gathering she had accomplished. James moved beside her with a steady, attentive presence, his gaze sweeping ahead and around, alert to the subtle irregularities of the ground and the scattered remnants of the marketplace, ensuring she navigated each step safely without pressing or directing her unnecessarily. The distant sound of a bell echoed softly from a partially standing church, its tone lingering in the still air, blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the warm breeze and the occasional bird call returning to the quiet town. Elisabeth paused briefly at a corner where sunlight streamed through the gaps of broken shutters, casting narrow, luminous stripes across the street, and she crouched to examine a small pile of grains partially hidden beneath the debris, brushing them gently into her hand and counting them with care. James knelt beside her, silently observing, his presence calming, a quiet assurance that she was not alone in her careful actions, offering the support of steady attention without intruding. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and found in it a quiet affirmation, a subtle understanding that extended beyond words, a shared acknowledgement of the small victories and fragile persistence that each step and choice represented. They continued together through the streets, the rhythm of their movement gradually forming a silent cadence, each step deliberate and measured, each glance and gesture building an unspoken dialogue of trust and attention. Elisabeth's eyes flicked to patches of resilient green pushing through cracks in stone, tiny signs of life asserting themselves against neglect and decay, and James pointed gently toward them, inviting her observation, encouraging the recognition of persistence and growth even in unlikely places. She knelt to inspect a cluster of shoots, brushing the soft leaves and feeling a sense of connection to the quiet endurance of life around her, a subtle reflection of the careful trust she was beginning to place in James. They moved into a small courtyard partially framed by collapsed walls and leaning beams, sunlight spilling across the stones, highlighting textures and details that had long been ignored in her world consumed by survival. Elisabeth paused, letting the warmth of the light and the gentle presence of James settle over her, a quiet moment of respite, a chance to draw a deep, grounding breath, and notice the continuity of life amid ruin. James remained nearby, careful to stay close yet unobtrusive, offering steady attention and the assurance of companionship as she examined the space, noting subtle patterns of light and shadow, the delicate green of moss, and the faint, persistent traces of life reclaiming the stones. The sun lowered further, painting the courtyard in warm amber and muted rose, elongating shadows across the ground and lending a calm, reflective weight to the scene. Elisabeth felt the gentle easing of tension that had accompanied her movements for weeks, the slow formation of trust and a quiet bond that seemed to grow in the shared awareness and careful observation of their surroundings. Each deliberate step, each pause, each glance contributed to the deepening sense of connection, forming a foundation of mutual understanding and patient companionship that allowed her to engage with the world with a growing sense of steadiness and confidence. They lingered for a moment, noticing the soft rustle of leaves, the faint glimmer of sunlight across broken stones, and the subtle signs of life that had emerged even in the shadow of destruction, and Elisabeth allowed herself a small exhale, a recognition that quiet attention, care, and presence could cultivate hope, trust, and the beginnings of a meaningful connection in a world still recovering from its fractures. The street stretched ahead, bathed in the fading light, and as they moved forward together, the rhythm of their steps, the subtle gestures, and the attentive glances formed a delicate harmony, a shared understanding that amidst uncertainty and the remnants of loss, small acts of steadiness and consideration could nurture the fragile growth of trust, companionship, and quiet hope. The twilight deepened, painting the sky with muted purples and soft amber that reflected across the uneven rooftops and empty streets of the town. Elisabeth Kraus moved with careful precision, her steps deliberate on the fractured cobblestones, the small pouch of grains and dried fruit secured at her side. James Carter followed, close enough to offer support without encroaching, his eyes alert to the subtle variations of the terrain and the scattered remnants of the marketplace that stretched before them. The evening air carried a faint, earthy scent, mixed with distant hints of greenery and the residual warmth of the fading sun. Elizabeth paused briefly to examine a small cluster of resilient plants sprouting through cracks in the stones, brushing away debris to reveal tender green shoots, and James crouched beside her, observing with quiet attentiveness, his presence steady and reassuring. She allowed a small smile to form, a rare acknowledgement of comfort and the quiet resilience she observed around her. They continued through the streets, the rhythm of their steps forming a silent cadence, each movement deliberate, each glance exchanged an unspoken communication of trust and understanding. The ruins of the town seemed to hold their breath, shadows stretching long and soft across walls and stones, absorbing the warm hues of the lingering light. Elizabeth bent down to inspect a fallen shutter, noting the small signs of life that persisted despite the disruption, and James offered a gentle nod, a subtle affirmation that her careful attention to detail was noticed and appreciated. The soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze accompanied their passage, mingling with the distant toll of a bell from the partially standing church. It sounded a gentle reminder of continuity and the subtle persistence of routine. Elizabeth adjusted her scarf, feeling the warmth of the last sunlight brush across her shoulders, and took a measured breath, sensing a growing steadiness. In her movements, a quiet confidence reinforced by James's careful presence. They entered a narrow lane where the light filtered through broken shutters, forming patterns of gold and shadow across the stones, and Elizabeth carefully maneuvered through scattered debris, her focus deliberate, mindful of every step. James followed closely, matching her pace, his gaze moving from the uneven ground to her steady movements, ensuring a sense of safety without imposing his guidance. She discovered a small collection of crates partially shielded by fallen beams and bent metal, carefully sifting through them to uncover a few tins of preserved fruit and small bags of grains, brushing away dust and debris with precise, deliberate motions. James offered a quiet nod of approval, his presence calm and reassuring, a steady force that allowed her to engage with her environment with measured confidence. The light continued to fade, shadows lengthening further across the street, lending a contemplative, almost reverent atmosphere to the courtyard they had reached. Elizabeth lifted her gaze to the horizon, noting the soft interplay of purple and amber in the sky, and felt a subtle spark of hope amid the quiet, enduring presence of life in small, resilient forms. They paused for a moment in the center of the courtyard, listening to the soft whisper of wind, the distant birds returning to roost, and the gentle sound of their own footsteps settling into a harmonious rhythm. Elizabeth felt a tentative trust growing, reinforced by James's careful attention, the quiet patience of his movements, and the unspoken understanding that she was not alone. The town, though fractured, offered moments of calm and subtle beauty, and Elizabeth allowed herself to notice the interplay of light and shadow, the emergence of green life in unlikely places, and the growing bond between herself and James, built on patience, observation, and quiet care. As the last light of day lingered on the stones and walls, Elizabeth drew a deep, grounding breath, sensing a subtle reassurance in the careful rhythm of their movement and the attentive presence beside her, a fragile but persistent hope taking root in the shared silence and deliberate pace of their evening journey through the recovering town. The sky had settled into deep indigo, sprinkled with the first hints of evening stars, casting a gentle, serene light over the fractured town. Elizabeth Kraus moved carefully, her steps deliberate on the uneven cobblestones, the pouch at her side shifting slightly with her movements. The quiet of the streets enveloped them, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the soft breeze and the distant toll of the church bell, its tone carrying a subtle rhythm across the empty square. James Carter walked beside her, close enough to provide support but allowing her autonomy, his eyes attentive to each irregularity in the ground, his posture steady and calm, giving her the reassurance of presence without intrusion. They turned into a narrow lane where sunlight from the fading horizon streaked through broken shutters, casting long, delicate shadows that danced across the walls and stones. Elizabeth paused to observe a small patch of moss thriving between cracks in the pavement, her fingers brushing the tender leaves, a moment of quiet reflection and connection to the subtle life that persisted around them. James knelt beside her, offering silent acknowledgement, his presence a stabilizing force, a gentle reminder that trust could be nurtured without words. She allowed herself a small, fleeting smile, the first genuine expression of comfort in days, and straightened, noting the calm attentiveness in his gaze. As they moved deeper into the street, their steps fell into a shared rhythm, a silent dialogue of movement and observation, each action deliberate, measured, and in harmony. Elisabeth discovered a small collection of crates along the edge of the lane, partially shielded by fallen beams, and carefully sifted through the contents, uncovering a few tins of preserved fruit and small bags of grains. She brushed away dust and debris with precision, each motion deliberate, and James nodded quietly, an unspoken affirmation of her choices, his calm presence reinforcing her growing confidence. The light continued to fade, softening into muted lavender and amber, shadows stretching across the stones, lending a contemplative atmosphere to the courtyard they approached. Elisabeth paused to inhale the evening air, carrying scents of earth, faint greenery, and distant wood smoke, grounding her in the moment and in the quiet presence beside her. James stayed near, careful to maintain proximity without crowding, his gaze scanning both the terrain and her movements, ensuring a sense of safety and stability. She observed the subtle interplay of light across broken windows and leaning walls, the emergence of small green shoots pushing through cracks, each detail reinforcing a sense of resilience and continuity. The rhythm of their steps, the attentive glances, and the deliberate pauses created a subtle harmony, a fragile but meaningful pattern of trust and companionship. Elisabeth felt the tension in her shoulders ease, a tentative sense of calm settling in as she moved in tandem with James, each step reinforcing the quiet bond that had grown from shared attention, care, and patience. They entered a slightly larger square where the remnants of a fountain cast delicate shadows, and Elisabeth crouched briefly, brushing small shoots of grass and moss, noticing the persistence of life in fragile, subtle forms. James observed silently, offering the assurance of presence, a steady grounding force that allowed her to fully engage with the moment. The evening light lingered across the stones, painting them in soft hues of amber and rose, and Elisabeth allowed herself to notice the harmony of the scene, the subtle beauty of resilience, and the quiet reassurance of companionship. Each careful step, each deliberate glance, each measured movement built a foundation of understanding, trust, and connection, demonstrating that even amidst the remnants of destruction, attentiveness, patience, and presence could cultivate hope and the beginnings of meaningful human connection. As the stars began to emerge and the town fell into a gentle hush, Elisabeth breathed deeply, absorbing the rhythm of shared steps and the quiet, steady presence beside her, recognizing that small, deliberate acts of care and observation could foster trust, companionship, and the fragile growth of hope in a world slowly recovering from its fractures. The evening had deepened into a serene palette of indigo and violet, the last traces of sunlight stretching across the fractured town, casting long, delicate shadows over the cobblestones and leaning walls. Elisabeth Kraus walked with careful precision, her pouch of food gently shifting with each step, a quiet reminder of survival and the small triumphs of the day. James Carter moved alongside her, close enough to offer support, yet respectful of her pace, his eyes attentive to each subtle variation in the ground and surrounding ruins. The air carried a faint scent of earth and distant greenery, mingled with the lingering warmth of the late sun, a soothing contrast to the starkness of the broken buildings. Elisabeth paused briefly to observe a tiny patch of resilient plants emerging from cracks in the pavement, brushing her fingers over the delicate leaves, marveling at their persistence. James knelt beside her, offering silent acknowledgement and reassurance, his calm presence a stabilizing force in the quiet street. She straightened, casting a glance toward him, noticing the gentle attentiveness in his posture and the subtle patience that guided his every movement. As they moved forward, the rhythm of their steps fell into a silent, deliberate cadence, each motion a dialogue of trust and observation. The town around them remained still, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant tolling of the church bell providing a gentle soundtrack to their measured progress. Elisabeth discovered a small pile of crates partially hidden by fallen beams, and with careful hands she sifted through the contents, uncovering tins of preserved fruit and small bags of grains, brushing away dust and debris, each motion precise and deliberate. James offered a quiet nod of approval, reinforcing her choices without words, his steady presence allowing her confidence to grow with each careful action. The twilight deepened, casting long shadows across the courtyard they approached, and Elisabeth took a moment to breathe deeply, inhaling the subtle mixture of earth, greenery, and distant smoke, grounding her in the present and in the quiet companionship beside her. They paused in the center of the courtyard, the interplay of fading light and elongated shadows creating a contemplative, almost reverent atmosphere. Elisabeth felt a gentle easing of tension, a small, persistent spark of hope growing within her, nurtured by the steady rhythm of shared movement and the careful attention of James. Around them, signs of life persisted in subtle forms, shoots of green emerging through cracks in stone, moss clinging to weathered surfaces, small birds returning to roost in the skeletal remains of once thriving buildings. Elisabeth allowed herself to notice these signs, drawing comfort from the quiet resilience and the growing bond between herself and James, built upon patience, care, and attentive presence. They continued onward, each step deliberate, each glance measured, moving through the remnants of the town with an unspoken harmony that reinforced trust and companionship. The lights softened further, bathing the streets in muted shades of amber and violet, and Elisabeth felt the cumulative effect of the day's cautious movements, shared observations, and subtle exchanges. James remained beside her, silent and attentive, offering the quiet assurance of steady presence as they navigated the open square and entered a partially intact building for brief respite. The interior carried the scent of aged wood and faint earthiness, sunlight filtering through gaps in broken shutters and illuminating dust motes in slow, floating patterns. Elisabeth paused to take in the space, noticing textures, patterns of light and shadow, and small signs of resilience in the walls and floor. James moved with measured steps, ensuring her comfort while remaining unobtrusive, reinforcing a sense of security and trust. As the evening deepened and stars began to appear faintly in the indigo sky, Elisabeth drew a slow, deliberate breath, sensing the quiet strength of their shared rhythm, the subtle bond of attentiveness, and the fragile yet persistent hope that had begun to take root amid the ruins of the town. Each deliberate motion, careful glance, and silent gesture contributed to the growing connection, forming a foundation of trust, patience, and companionship that allowed Elisabeth to engage with her surroundings with cautious confidence, and to feel the quiet reassurance of another human presence that could steady the heart even in uncertain times. The stars had begun to sprinkle the indigo sky as Elisabeth Kraus and James Carter navigated the quiet streets, their footsteps soft against the uneven cobblestones, echoing lightly in the stillness of the evening. Elisabeth carried her small pouch carefully, its contents a tangible reminder of both survival and the modest victories of the day. James remained near, walking with deliberate attentiveness, his eyes scanning the ground and surroundings for any subtle irregularities, a quiet assurance of safety that allowed Elisabeth to move with growing confidence. The town seemed to hold a gentle hush, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the cool evening breeze and the distant tolling of a church bell that reverberated softly across the empty squares. Elisabeth paused at a corner where the light of a low moon touched the edges of broken windows and leaning walls, illuminating patches of resilient moss and tiny shoots of green pushing through cracks. She crouched briefly to inspect the new growth, brushing away dust and debris, noting the persistence of life in subtle, fragile forms. James crouched beside her, his calm presence a stabilizing force, offering reassurance without the need for words, a silent acknowledgement of her careful attention and the tentative trust growing between them. She straightened, glancing at him fully, noticing the quiet steadiness in his posture, the patience that guided every measured movement, and felt a small spark of reassurance settle in her chest. As they continued through the streets, the rhythm of their steps fell into a shared cadence, deliberate and attentive, forming an unspoken dialogue of trust and observation. The air carried the faint scent of earth and distant greenery, mingling with the cool hint of evening, and Elisabeth inhaled deeply, sensing a subtle calm in the environment and the gentle reassurance of companionship beside her. They reached a small courtyard partially framed by collapsed structures and leaning beams, where the moonlight cast delicate, elongated shadows across the stones and broken surfaces. Elisabeth paused to observe the soft interplay of light and shadow, noting the subtle textures and the quiet emergence of life in unexpected places. James remained close, moving with measured steps that allowed her space while providing steady presence, reinforcing a sense of security and the growing bond between them. She knelt briefly to inspect a small cluster of green shoots emerging through the cracks in the stone, brushing her fingers gently over the tender leaves and marveling at the quiet persistence of life. James offered a subtle nod, an unspoken affirmation, his gaze attentive, reinforcing the developing rhythm of trust and patience that defined their shared passage through the town. The shadows lengthened further as the moon rose higher, the courtyard bathed in soft silver light, revealing the delicate contours of the buildings and the enduring signs of resilience in the stones and plant life. Elisabeth felt a quiet relief, a tentative sense of hope and calm growing within her, nurtured by the steady presence of James, the careful attention, and the shared rhythm of movement. Each step, each glance, each deliberate pause reinforced the subtle, fragile connection, a foundation of understanding, trust, and companionship built from patience, observation, and careful attention to the world around them. The quiet hum of the evening, the interplay of shadow and light, and the subtle signs of life created a gentle, reflective atmosphere that allowed Elisabeth to engage fully with her surroundings and recognize the comforting strength of a consistent, attentive presence beside her. As they moved through the courtyard and toward the narrower streets beyond, Elisabeth drew a slow, deliberate breath, absorbing the rhythm of their steps, the attentive glances, and the subtle interplay of care and observation that had come to define their evening journey. In the deepening night, the quiet trust between them became a delicate harmony, a shared understanding. That even amid ruins, the small, measured acts of presence, attention, and patience could nurture hope, reinforce companionship, and foster the beginnings of enduring connection in a world slowly recovering from its fractures. The night had grown deeper, a cool, gentle darkness settling over the fractured town, the stars twinkling faintly in the indigo sky and casting a soft glow across the rooftops and empty streets. Elisabeth Kraus moved with careful attention, her steps deliberate on the uneven cobblestones, the pouch at her side shifting slightly with each motion, a tangible reminder of the small successes of the day. James Carter remained near, his presence steady and calm, eyes scanning the surroundings, ensuring that every step she took was met with careful observation and quiet support. The air carried the subtle scent of earth and faint greenery, mingling with the residual warmth of the day, and Elisabeth inhaled deeply, feeling a measured steadiness settle within her. They entered a small open square, partially enclosed by the remnants of leaning walls and collapsed structures, where the moonlight filtered through gaps and broken shutters, illuminating the uneven stones and small patches of resilient moss. Elisabeth paused to observe a cluster of tender green shoots pushing through cracks, brushing away dust and debris, marveling at the quiet persistence of life. James knelt beside her, offering a subtle nod, his attentive presence a stabilizing force that allowed her to engage fully with her surroundings without hesitation or fear. She straightened and glanced at him, noting the calm patience in his gaze and the deliberate care in his movements, and a small sense of reassurance warmed her chest. As they moved through the square, their steps fell into a measured rhythm, deliberate and quiet, forming an unspoken dialogue of trust and awareness. The faint rustle of leaves in the cool night air and the soft chime of the distant church bell accompanied their movement, lending a quiet music to the evening that underscored the stillness and resilience around them. Elisabeth examined a small pile of crates leaning against a crumbling wall, carefully sifting through the contents to reveal a few tins of preserved fruit and bags of grains, brushing dust from each item with precise, thoughtful motions. James observed without interference, his steady presence a reassurance, nodding subtly to acknowledge her careful work, reinforcing the unspoken rhythm of their cooperation. The moonlight deepened, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the stones and walls, highlighting textures and subtle signs of life reclaiming the town. Elisabeth allowed herself to notice the delicate interplay of light and shadow, the soft green of moss and shoots, and the quiet patterns of resilience that filled the space, a gentle contrast to the starkness of the ruins. James stayed close, offering silent guidance and careful attention, his presence unobtrusive but steady, reinforcing the growing sense of trust and understanding between them. Each careful step, glance, and deliberate movement added to the rhythm of shared awareness, a subtle foundation of companionship and patience, allowing Elisabeth to engage with the environment with increased confidence. The square opened toward a narrow alley, where broken shutters and leaning walls created a corridor of muted light and shadow, and Elisabeth moved slowly, noting each texture, each crack, each sign of life, following the deliberate guidance of James without losing her own agency. The air was cool and still, carrying faint hints of earth and distant greenery, and Elisabeth drew a measured breath, feeling the quiet reassurance of his presence beside her, the subtle rhythm of shared steps and attentive glances forming a delicate harmony. The stars above shimmered faintly, casting a gentle glow across the town, and Elisabeth allowed herself to feel the quiet bloom of hope and connection that had been nurtured through the careful attention, patience, and deliberate presence shared in the movement of the evening. Each motion, glance, and pause strengthened the fragile bond, creating a shared rhythm of trust and companionship that offered a sense of safety, calm, and the promise of continuity in a world slowly reclaiming life from the ruins. As they progressed through the alley and into a quieter stretch of street, Elisabeth breathed deeply, absorbing the subtle harmony of movement, the attentive presence beside her, and the delicate assurance that care, patience, and observation could foster trust, companionship, and the quiet growth of hope in the recovering town. The sky had darkened fully to a deep indigo, scattered stars twinkling faintly above the fractured rooftops and narrow streets of the town. Elisabeth Kraus and James Carter moved slowly, deliberately, their steps quiet against the uneven cobblestones, the weight of the day and the accumulated small successes of survival settling into a calm rhythm between them. Elisabeth carried her pouch close, the contents a modest but significant symbol of persistence and careful effort. James remained at her side, his presence steady, attentive to each subtle variation in the ground, guiding without imposing, offering reassurance with measured, unobtrusive movements. The cool night air carried the scent of earth, faint greenery, and distant smoke, mingling with the residual warmth of the day, grounding Elisabeth in the present as she navigated the quiet streets. They reached a small open square where the remnants of an old fountain cast gentle shadows in the pale moonlight, illuminating broken stones, leaning walls, and small patches of resilient moss. Elisabeth knelt briefly, brushing her fingers over the tender green shoots emerging through the cracks, marveling at the quiet perseverance of life, and James crouched beside her, offering subtle acknowledgement, a stabilizing presence that allowed her to focus fully on the fragile beauty surrounding them. She straightened and glanced at him, noticing the calm attentiveness in his eyes, the deliberate patience in his posture, and the gentle steadiness that had been guiding her steps throughout the day. Their movement continued in tandem, a shared rhythm of careful steps, deliberate glances, and measured pauses, forming an unspoken dialogue of trust and understanding that permeated the quiet night. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant chime of the church bell provided a delicate soundtrack, underscoring the stillness and persistence of life amidst the ruins. Elisabeth examined a small pile of crates leaning against a partially standing wall, uncovering tins of preserved fruit and small bags of grains, brushing away dust and debris with careful precision. James observed silently, nodding ever so slightly in acknowledgement, reinforcing the subtle, quiet trust that had developed through hours of attentive presence and shared vigilance. The light of the rising moon deepened, casting long, delicate shadows across the courtyard and surrounding structures, highlighting the textures of stone and the gentle emergence of plant life. Elisabeth allowed herself to notice the soft interplay of light and shadow, the muted colors of moss and shoots, and the sense of resilience quietly thriving in the overlooked corners of the town. James remained nearby, offering measured guidance and attentive presence, neither imposing nor intrusive, allowing Elisabeth to engage fully with the environment, her confidence growing in tandem with the trust she had learned to place in him. Each deliberate step, each attentive glance, each subtle gesture reinforced the fragile bond between them, a foundation of patience, understanding, and companionship that had been nurtured over the course of the evening. The quiet harmony of their movement, the gentle signs of life emerging from the ruins, and the subtle, attentive presence beside her created a profound sense of calm and hope. Elisabeth drew a slow, deep breath, feeling the accumulated weight of the day ease, the growing sense of connection with James, and the delicate yet persistent hope that even in a world marred by disruption and scarcity, small acts of care, observation, and presence could cultivate trust, companionship, and the beginnings of something enduring. As they moved through the final stretch of the square toward a narrow alley leading out of the courtyard, Elisabeth felt the rhythm of their steps, the gentle attentiveness of James beside her, and the quiet promise of continued support and shared understanding. A fragile yet resilient harmony bridging the spaces between past uncertainty and the possibility of trust, hope, and companionship.